You want to buy a cruise ship. You want to line up thousands of eager tourists, stuff them onto a giant floating steel fortress, charge them $9 for a draft beer, and watch the cash rain down onto your balance sheet. Sounds simple enough, right? After all, the global cruise industry pulled in a staggering $71 billion in revenue in 2024 alone, heading straight towards $78 billion by 2026. Surely, there's room for one more player to grab a slice of that ocean-sized pie. Well, there's always room. The real question is whether your balance sheet can survive long enough for you to enjoy it. Before you buy your first captain's hat, let's get one thing straight. A modern mega cruise ship is not a boat. It is a floating, hyper-leveraged, self-contained metropolis. It has to generate its own electricity, desalinate its own drinking water, process its own raw sewage, feed a small army 3 gourmet meals a day, provide round-the-clock Broadway entertainment, and navigate thousands of nautical miles across open ocean all simultaneously, in international waters, with zero margin for error. Take a look at Royal Caribbean's Icon of the Seas, launched in January of 2024. This isn't just a vessel, it's an engineering absurdity. At 1,197 feet long, it stands 20 decks tall, with 18 of those decks dedicated exclusively to guests. It carries up to 7,600 passengers, alongside a crew of 2,350 people. That is nearly 10,000 human beings living on a single hull. To put that scale into perspective, if you stood Icon of the Seas on its end, it would dwarf most skyscrapers in North America, sitting just slightly shorter than the iconic Empire State Building laid on its side. On board this floating steel city, you'll find 40 distinct restaurants and bars, a full Broadway-style theater, an ice skating rink, 6 record-breaking water slides, including the first suspended infinity pool ever engineered at sea, a full-scale medical hospital, a luxury shopping mall, a high-stakes casino, and high-speed internet beamed down directly from satellite constellations. The price tag to construct this single-ocean monument? A eye-watering $2 billion. That is not a misprint. $2 billion just to build one ship. And here's the cold, brutal financial reality. $2 billion is merely the entry fee. That is what you pay simply to exist at the top table of modern maritime competition. If you want to scale down, a mid-sized vessel will still cost you between $600 million and $900 million. Even a tiny boutique luxury ship designed for a few hundred ultra-wealthy passengers will easily wipe $400 million to $500 million off your ledger. In this business, cheap is entirely relative, and small still requires a $500 million loan agreement. Now, you might assume that buying the ship is where most operators go broke, but in the cruise industry, buying the ship is just the prelude. Before your vessel carries its first passenger, before you sell a single martini, before anyone steps foot on your gangway at any port on Earth, you are already bleeding cash at an alarming velocity. First comes the financing. Virtually no cruise line drops $2 billion in cold, hard corporate cash to buy a vessel. They take out massive corporate debt packages, structured over 12 to 15 years. Interest payments begin ticking the exact millisecond the contract is signed. For a $2 billion asset like Icon of the Seas, debt servicing alone generates tens of millions of dollars in annual interest expense before a single tourist buys a ticket. Then comes the legal magic trick: registration. Have you ever wondered why cruise lines spend hundreds of millions building headquarters in pristine Miami skyscrapers, yet virtually none of their ships fly the Stars and Stripes? Look at the stern of almost any megaship sailing out of Port Miami. You won't see an American flag. You'll see the flag of the Bahamas, Panama, or Bermuda. Over 200 ocean-going cruise ships currently fly the Bahamian flag alone. Disney, Norwegian, Royal Caribbean, Carnival, they all do it. The rationale is disarmingly direct: corporate arbitrage. By registering their ships under what the maritime industry politely calls a flag of convenience, these multi-billion-dollar corporations register their assets in nations that charge virtually zero corporate income tax and enforce minimal operational regulations. Registering in Nassau instead of Florida saves cruise giants hundreds of millions of dollars every single year, money that would otherwise flow directly into the United States Treasury. Of course, there's a catch. When a global crisis hits and you need a federal bailout, the government of the Bahamas isn't exactly sitting on a multi-trillion-dollar reserve to rescue your balance sheet. But until that reckoning arrives, the tax savings are intoxicating. And then there is the labor matrix. To run a floating city like Icon of the Seas, you need 2,350 crew members working in the engine rooms, the galleys, the laundries, and the staterooms. Most of these workers are recruited from developing economies in the Philippines, Indonesia, India, and Eastern Europe. They sign rigorous contracts lasting 8 to 10 months at a time, working 7 days a week with 0 days off. Under the jurisdiction of the flags of convenience, American labor laws like the Fair Labor Standards Act simply do not exist. Financial investigations published by outlets like The Hustle revealed the stark reality of maritime labor economics. Entry-level cleaners and dishwashers often sign mandatory contracts requiring 308 hours of labor per month, earning between $400 and $700 a month. That breaks down to roughly $1.62 to $2.27 an hour. It is a hyper-efficient, legal labor machine. The tax savings secured in Nassau filter down through the entire corporate structure. Minimal corporate tax paid, bottom-tier wage costs unlocked, and structural overhead reduced to absolute rock bottom. So, you've secured your $2 billion debt package, registered your vessel in Nassau, and contracted 2,000 crew members. Now, let's talk about the bill that arrives on your desk every single morning before you've even had your first cup of coffee. According to operational data published from Royal Caribbean's financial disclosures, a 250,000 gross ton megaship like Icon of the Seas carries an estimated annual operating expense of roughly $355 million. Divide $355 million by 365 days. You are staring at a daily burn rate of approximately $920,000 per day. Read that number again. Nearly $1 million every single 24 hours. Whether the ship is packed to capacity or sitting completely empty, whether it is cruising through the Caribbean or tied to a dock in port, $920,000 evaporates from your bank account every single day just for the privilege of existing. Where does that money go? First, fuel. Outside of labor, heavy fuel oil is the single largest variable expense in maritime operations. A mega cruise ship burns between 150 and 250 tons of fuel per day when underway. At prevailing global prices of $500 to $600 per ton, keeping the engine's firing costs between $75,000 and $150,000 every single day. This is precisely why cruise ships leisure along at 18 to 20 knots rather than pushing toward their maximum design speeds. The physics of hydrodynamics dictate that the relationship between speed and fuel consumption is non-linear, it's exponential. Pushing a 250,000-ton vessel just a few knots faster doesn't slightly increase your fuel bill, it multiplies it exponentially. Second, provisions. You might expect feeding 10,000 people 3 meals a day on an endless luxury buffet to be a financial nightmare. In reality, raw food costs account for only about 11% of total operating expenses, roughly $13 to $14 per person per day. On a vessel with 6,000 passengers and 2,000 crew, that's still $112,000 daily spent strictly on ingredients. How do cruise lines keep food costs so low? Ruthless bulk purchasing directly from agricultural conglomerates, completely bypassing traditional wholesale distributors. Third, port fees and maintenance. Every time your 20-deck Fortress ties up at a pier in Nassau, Cozumel, Barcelona, or Santorini, you hand over tens of thousands of dollars to local port authorities for the privilege of docking. And then comes the dry dock requirement. International maritime classification societies mandate that every passenger vessel enter a specialized dry dock twice every 5 years, for full technical hull inspections and mechanical overhauls. A standard dry dock event costs a minimum of $12 million. But when Royal Caribbean sent Allure of the Seas in for a massive modernization in April 2025, the price tag hit $100 million. For weeks, the ship generated exactly $0 in revenue while burning tens of millions in capital upgrades. Add insurance premiums for a $2 billion asset navigating hurricane zones, P&I liability coverage for thousands of guests, and environmental compliance fees. And the conclusion is unavoidable. A megaship costs between $800,000 and well over $1 million every single day just to stay floating. This brings us to the single biggest misconception everyday consumers have about the cruise industry. People look at discount travel sites, see a $400 headline price for a 7-day Caribbean cruise, and think, how can they possibly make money? The ticket price must be a loss leader. They are half right. The ticket is unequivocally a loss leader. But most consumers fail to realize just how deeply engineered that trap really is. When you buy a 7-day cruise ticket for $400 or $500, the cruise line is effectively subsidizing your entry. Once you deduct travel agent commissions, mandatory port taxes, and base operating overhead, the net profit margin on that ticket sale is razor thin and often completely negative. The ticket price is simply the bait. You, the passenger, are the yield asset. The moment you walk up that gangway and step on board, you enter one of the most sophisticated, high-margin, psychologically engineered monetization environments ever created. Think about the physical reality. You are trapped on a steel vessel in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. You cannot leave. You cannot walk down the street to a competing bar. The nearest competitor is literally past the horizon. If you are thirsty, you buy a drink from the ship. If you want Wi-Fi to check your work email, you purchase a satellite package from the ship. If you want a massage, you visit the ship's spa. If you want to explore an island, you book an excursion through the ship's tour desk. If you play blackjack, you gamble at the ship's casino. In corporate financial reports, this is classified as onboard revenue, and it is where the real fortune is extracted. Look at Royal Caribbean's official 2024 financial filings. The company carried 8.56 million passengers that year, generating $16.48 billion in total revenue. A massive 30% of that total, roughly $4.3 billion, came not from ticket sales, but from purchases passengers made after they boarded the ship. The profit margins on onboard revenue are astronomical. Consider an all-inclusive beverage package like Carnival's Cheers program, priced at up to $90 per person per day. Because cruise conglomerates purchase spirits and wine by the cargo container at wholesale rates, the actual product cost of the alcohol consumed in that package is a tiny fraction of the price tag. Gross margins on beverage sales regularly exceed 80%. Furthermore, because modern ships run on cashless room keys and wearable RFID wristbands, the psychological friction of spending money vanishes. You aren't handing over green dollar bills, you're simply tapping a plastic card. In fact, Royal Caribbean's 2025 financial data revealed a terrifying metric. Nearly 50% of all onboard revenue was secured before the ship even left the port. Passengers pre-purchased drink packages, specialty dining reservations, and shore excursions months in advance through the company's smartphone app. Guests who pre-booked on the app spent an average of 2.5 times more than those who waited to buy on board. Even the physical architecture of the ship is designed around consumer psychology. Duty-free luxury shops are strategically placed directly adjacent to the main gangway exits. The casino is positioned in the high-traffic central corridor that guests must walk through to reach the main dining rooms. Specialty restaurants are clustered around the central atrium to entice guests away from the complimentary buffet. The headline ticket price gets you onto the ship. The ship's architecture turns you into a high-margin cash spigot. Now, logic would dictate that building a bigger ship creates more complexity, higher financial risk, and greater operational headaches. And that is true, but in maritime economics, building bigger is the only way to survive. This is governed by the most vital financial principle on the oceans: economies of scale. Consider what remains fixed regardless of whether a ship carries 2,000 passengers or 7,000 passengers. You still only need one bridge team, one captain, one chief engineer, one primary propulsion plant, one theatre cast, and one set of port negotiation teams. When you spread those massive fixed costs across 7,000 paying guests instead of 2,000, your operating cost per passenger drops off a cliff. That cost reduction allows mega operators to undercut smaller rivals on ticket prices while pulling in vastly higher total net profits. A standard modern cruise ship typically generates $200 million to $300 million in annual revenue, delivering $20 million to $40 million in net income. By deploying mega vessels like Icon of the Seas, Royal Caribbean pushed its 2025 adjusted earnings per share to between $14 and $15, a level of profitability that Wall Street tech companies would envy. However, operating at this massive scale creates terrifying structural fragility. When a floating city fails, it doesn't fail small, it fails catastrophically. Cast your mind back to the 10th of February 2013. The Carnival Triumph set sail from Galveston, Texas, carrying over 4,200 passengers and crew for a 4-day trip to Mexico. 4 days later, a fuel leak from a diesel generator ignited a fierce fire in the aft engine room. The automated suppression systems put out the flames, but the thermal damage destroyed the ship's primary electrical cabling. The vessel suffered a total power blackout in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. The air conditioning stopped. Food refrigeration failed. And, most infamously, the electrically powered vacuum system operating all 1,400 toilets on board collapsed. For 5 horrific days, 4,200 people drifted under the blazing sun without operational plumbing. Raw sewage backed up into passenger hallways. Raw waste was collected in red biohazard bags piled outside cabin doors. Passengers slept on open decks to escape the unbearable heat and stench. 4 commercial tugboats took 5 agonizing days to drag the powerless hulk to Mobile, Alabama. The media dubbed it the poop cruise, but the financial fallout was far more devastating than the headlines. Subsequent court investigations revealed a damning truth. Carnival's internal maintenance logs showed that the specific diesel generator that caused the fire had been overdue for routine maintenance for over a year. In the 2 years leading up to the fire, there had been 9 separate incidents of fuel leaks from flexible fuel lines on that exact same vessel. Carnival knew the risk, deferred the maintenance, and sailed anyway. The legal and financial avalanche was swift. Carnival refunded every ticket, handed out $500 in cash per passenger, covered all transport costs, and issued future cruise credits. Lawsuits poured in, culminating in massive confidential settlements. Carnival was forced to commit over $500 million to a fleet-wide safety overhaul across all 24 of its vessels, installing redundant power generators and upgraded fire suppression systems. The ship itself was pulled out of service and sent to Spain for a $200 million complete gutting and rebuilding, eventually renamed the Carnival Sunrise. Total financial damage from one deferred fuel line inspection? Over $700 million. In the cruise business, the boundary between printing cash and triggering a near-fatal financial catastrophe is sometimes as thin as a single $50 fuel hose. As disastrous as the Carnival Triumph was for corporate PR, nothing in maritime history prepared the industry for the apocalyptic shockwave that hit in March 2020. When COVID-19 broke out on board the Diamond Princess off the coast of Japan in February 2020, resulting in 700 infections and 9 deaths, the global news media immediately labeled cruise ships floating Petri dishes. By mid-March 2020, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control issued a sweeping no-sail order. Within days, the entire global cruise fleet was forcibly grounded. Over 400 megaships were stranded at anchorages around the world, carrying 0 passengers, generating $0 in revenue, yet burning millions in cash every single day. This crisis exposed the ultimate vulnerability of the cruise business model. High fixed operational overhead paired with extreme leverage. Consider Carnival Corporation. In 2019, Carnival was an unstoppable money-making engine, pulling in $20.8 billion in revenue, roughly $57 million every single day. But when operations ceased, Carnival's cash burn rate sat at a mind-boggling $650 million per month. Why? Because even when a cruise ship sits idle with no guests, you cannot simply turn off the key and walk away. The engines must run continuously to prevent catastrophic mechanical degradation. Skeleton crews must be maintained, fed, and paid. Port anchoring fees must be settled. Insurance premiums remain due. And, crucially, interest payments on multi-billion-dollar ship loans do not pause for global health emergencies. In 2020 alone, Carnival Corporation reported a staggering net loss of $10.24 billion, losing an average of $28 million every 24 hours. To avoid corporate liquidation, cruise companies embarked on a desperate capital-raising spree. Between March and December 2020, Carnival issued $19 billion in high-yield corporate debt and equity, scraped older ships for junk metal, and cancelled future vessel deliveries. By 2023, Carnival's total long-term debt burden had ballooned from $12 billion pre-pandemic to an astronomical $32 billion. Even by 2025, as passenger demand roared back to record highs and ships sailed at over 100% occupancy, that historical debt hangover continued to strangle corporate balance sheets. In fiscal 2025, Carnival's interest expense alone consumed $1.35 billion, more than 6 times the $206 million they paid in interest back in 2019. Think about that structural trap. Carnival now has to generate nearly $1.4 billion in annual profit just to pay the interest on the debt it took on to survive 2020 before paying down a single penny of the principal. One macro shock, another pandemic, or a sudden global recession, and that debt mountain becomes an absolute corporate death sentence. Despite the terrifying debt burdens and catastrophic operational risks, the titans of this industry continue to thrive. How? Because the market is controlled by an ironclad oligopoly that practices vertical integration on a scale never before seen in commercial history. 3 corporate behemoths, Carnival Corporation, Royal Caribbean Group, and Norwegian Cruise Line Holdings, control roughly 72.2% of the entire global cruise market. When 3 players dominate nearly 3/4 of a $71 billion global industry, they dictate supplier pricing, command massive bulk fuel discounts, and wield immense leverage over port authorities worldwide. But their ultimate financial masterpiece is not the ship. It is the private island. Recognizing that stopping at public ports like Nassau or Cozumel meant sharing passenger spending with local taxi drivers, local restaurants, and independent tour operators, cruise lines decided to cut out the local economies entirely. Royal Caribbean dropped between $250 million and $450 million, transforming a secluded strip of land in the Bahamas into Perfect Day at Coco Cay, a private, corporate-owned island paradise. Look at the financial genius of Coco Cay. When a Royal Caribbean ship docks at Coco Cay, passengers step off the ship into an environment where every single business is owned 100% by Royal Caribbean. Want to enter the island water park? That's $74 to $189 per person per day. Want to rent a private overwater cabana for the afternoon? That will cost you upwards of $1,000. Want a cocktail or a burger? You use your room key card, paying Royal Caribbean's premium prices. By 2026, Perfect Day at Coco Cay alone is projected to generate over $600 million in direct annual revenue for Royal Caribbean. Similarly, Disney's private island, Castaway Cay, paid out over $220 million in direct dividends to its corporate parent between 2014 and 2024. This is vertical integration perfected. The consumer pays Royal Caribbean to get on the ship. They pay Royal Caribbean while sailing on the ship. Then the ship drops them off at an island owned by Royal Caribbean, where they spend hundreds more buying goods from Royal Caribbean. Zero cash leakage to local populations, zero independent competition, 100% corporate margin capture. So, let's run the final numbers on the ledger. What is the ultimate financial verdict of owning a mega cruise ship? Let's look at a typical 7-day sailing on a modern mega vessel during a good year. You carry 6,000 passengers at an industry standard 108% occupancy capacity achieved, because family cabins hold more than 2 guests. Average ticket revenue comes in at $1,344 per passenger, yielding $8 million in gross ticket sales. Average onboard spending adds another $582 per passenger in high-margin drinks, casino gaming, excursions, and Wi-Fi, adding $3.5 million. Total gross revenue for a single 7-day cruise, $11.5 million. Against that, you subtract roughly $7 million in weekly operating costs, fuel, food, labor, port fees, and depreciation. That leaves you with a net operational profit of roughly $4.5 million per sailing. Run 50 sailings a year, and a single megaship can generate $200 million to $300 million in top-line revenue, leaving $20 million to $40 million in net corporate profit after debt servicing and corporate overhead. Sounds brilliant, doesn't it? But pause and look at the capital efficiency. Generating $40 million in annual net profit on a $2 billion asset gives you a baseline payback period of 50 years. Even if you deploy an ultra-efficient mega vessel that cuts the payback period down to 25 or 30 years, you are still tying up $2 billion in capital in a rapidly depreciating, saltwater corroding asset that requires multi-million-dollar dry dock overhauls every 30 months, and that is during a good year. If a global recession hits, if fuel prices spike by 20%, or if a regional conflict forces route cancellations, occupancy drops from 108% down to 70%. Because your operational burn rate of $920,000 a day is fixed, that $40 million annual profit instantly vanishes, transforming into a $10 million to $30 million annual net loss. In 2024, Royal Caribbean recorded a net margin of 17.5%, earning roughly $336 in profit from the $1,926 spent by the average passenger. That margin sounds healthy on Wall Street, until you realize how fast 17.5% evaporates the moment fuel costs tick up or occupancy dips by a fraction. The companies that dominate this ocean trade are not hospitality businesses. They are hyper-leveraged, tax-arbitraging, data-driven financial institutions that happen to operate floating hotels. They survive because they have achieved monumental scale, secured tax-free jurisdictions, engineered psychological spending traps, and locked up private islands. The next time you stand on the beach and watch one of these billion-dollar floating cities glide past the horizon, remember what you are actually looking at. You are looking at the most sophisticated wealth extraction machine ever built, a floating fortress designed to convert your vacation dreams into high-margin corporate yield, your captivity into gross profit, and your relaxation into Wall Street debt service. They say the house always wins. In this business, they simply built the entire house, registered it in Nassau, floated it out into international waters, and made sure you paid $90 a day just to drink at the bar.